Welcome to the King's Gambit, the most aggressive chess opening. From move 1, you strike the center and your opponent's confidence by pushing the pawn in front of the king's bishop to the f4 square, leading to lightning-fast checkmates. In this position, your opponent will usually either capture your pawn or try defending their own pawn somehow, and sometimes they will throw in this check, queen to h4. So, what's the idea here? Of course, you can block the check, and you will, but after the queen slides back, it appears that your king is really exposed. All the surrounding squares seem vulnerable. This game is a really beautiful example of how white should handle that situation. White first played pawn to d3, just to solidify the center. After the trade of pawns, black played pawn to d5. Another clever idea. Black is capitalizing on the pin. The pawn on e4 is pinned to white's king and is therefore under attack. By the way, what makes this game interesting is that the black player is an international master. He played very creative chess, and this was a real over-the-board game, not just an online blitz. So, white plays knight to c3 to defend the pawn on e4. Black responds with bishop to e6. Another very tricky move. Here's what black is trying to say. You know what? You can go ahead and capture this pawn. Look at this. It's a juicy pawn. You attack it twice, and I only defend it once. So, why not take the pawn? Well, of course, black has a plan. If white were tempted by this little trick, then after the capture, black would simply recapture. This would open up a discovered check, and since the white king would be in check and the rook would be attacked at the same time, black would win the game. White said, "No thank you, I'd rather live." Instead, white played queen to a2 to shield the king. After the trade of pieces in the center, black was likely worried that white's knight could jump forward to either the d5 or b5 square. To prevent this, black played pawn to c6 to cover those squares. White castled kingside. Black continued developing pieces. White followed suit. Black then castled kingside as well, following one of the classical opening principles. Castle within the first 10 moves and you'll be fine, you'll be safe. However, this game became a perfect example of an online meme. How it's supposed to be versus how it actually is in my life. Because yes, black did castle within the first 10 moves, but right after that came the shocker. Queen to a6. White was not aiming to take pawns. White was aiming to take souls. This was a spectacular queen sacrifice. And what's the point? Well, if black captures the queen, they cannot actually survive, because after white recaptures, there is a crisscross checkmate. The real problem for black is that they cannot ignore the queen either. If they ignore it, white can simply capture the pawn on a 7 and deliver checkmate. Moreover, even if black tries to distract white, white will not be forced into defending, because again, white is here to take souls. White could simply play queen takes pawn on c6, forcing the exact same checkmate on black. The next trap really turns things upside down, and it's quite funny. After black accepts the pawn on f4 and then plays pawn to g5, which is the main line, black protects the pawn and also threatens to push it forward to attack white's knight. White responds with bishop to c4, and then allows black to push the pawn forward, carrying out the threat. At this point, white is actually in a bit of trouble, because in the main variation here, you simply give up the knight and castle kingside, putting everything into your attack. However, there is another move, knight to a5, which is a tricky alternative. The computer does not approve of it, but in real blitz games, it works remarkably well. Here's the point. The knight now attacks the pawn on f7, and together with the queen, it also attacks the pawn on g4. On the surface, this looks great, but it fails to queen to h4 check. At first, this check may not seem devastating, but it forces the white king to move, making it vulnerable. On the other hand, it is still not very easy for black, because white is still attacking the pawn on f7 twice and also attacking the pawn on g4 with both the queen and the knight. Therefore, black must do something about this. In most cases, they play the most natural move, knight to h6, because it appears to guard both pawns. It looks pretty good for black. You develop a knight, you solve both problems. So what could be wrong? Surprisingly, in this position, it is actually a mistake. White plays pawn to d4, grabbing control of the center and attacking the pawn on f4. Black usually responds by kicking the knight away. White retreats the knight, and the pawn on f4 remains under attack. Black then pushes the pawn forward, trying to open lines toward white's king and begin an attack. But white is fine with this. Good things come to those who bait. White plays pawn to g3, even inviting black to push further and attack. Moreover, with pawn to g3, white can lock the position. If black does not push the pawn, no problem. White's king will be perfectly safe, and white can calmly move the king to safety and bring the rook into play. However, in most cases, black will try queen to h3, aiming to infiltrate with the queen and thinking they are about to win. It looks convincing. The pawn chain is strong, the queen is entering, the rook is attacked, and multiple pawns are under fire. The opponent is already anticipating victory. But after knight to f2, white locks the door, and the game is essentially over. Whatever move black plays next, white is already preparing the finishing touches, hinting to the opponent that it's time to resign. This next idea works even against experienced opponents. In one example, Ian Nepomniachtchi was playing as white in the titled Tuesday event, against a 2,200 rated player. White played pawn to h4, undermining the pawn chain. After pawn to g4, the white knight jumped forward to e5. Black developed the knight to f6, attacking white's central pawn. White captured black's pawn of g4, black recaptured to e4. So far, everything looked normal. White then played pawn to d3, an excellent move, which attacks the knight and simultaneously opens the diagonal for the bishop, allowing white to regain the gambit pawn on the next turn. Of course, the black knight does not want to retreat. Instead, it jumps to g3. At this point, it appears that white has blundered. Down a pawn, king exposed, rook attacked. What is going on? But white remains calm and simply captures with bishop to f4 pawn, as if saying, "I eat challenges for breakfast. You want my rook? Go ahead." In this game, black indeed first delivered queen to a7 for a check and then captured the rook. But surprisingly, this move was a blunder, something extremely difficult to realize unless you know the trap. Here, white plays bishop to g5, attacking the queen. The queen must respond. Pawn to f6 is not an option, since two white pieces control that square. Therefore, the queen has to move. Black chose queen to b4 with check. After white blocked the check, black captured another pawn on b2. At this point, it appears white is completely destroyed. The rook on h1 is gone, the other rook is in danger. The king side is shattered, and the queen side is falling apart. Black is likely expecting to win at any moment, but white is ready to put the opponent's ego in check. After knight to f6, white launches a counterattack. The black king is forced to move, and then white played knight to d5, opening up a discovered check. And then, it seemed, the game would end with perpetual check. Just kidding. Instead, there was a nightmare finish waiting on the board. This trap is simple, but it's extremely effective and happens often, especially against less experienced players. The position usually begins after you have managed to undermine black's pawn chain. At this point, black might believe that pushing the pawn to f6 is the perfect solution. Why does this happen? If black captures right away, the central pawns become weak, and you can quickly win them with your bishop and rook. Pawn to h6 seems to hold the pawn chain, but after trades, recapturing would lose the rook. Pawn to g4 is another try, but your knight jumps forward, adding strong kingside pressure. Because of this, pawn to f6 often appears safe, a move seen in over 150,000 games. But this is where the trap springs. Instead of playing the expected pawn capture, you sacrifice with knight takes pawn on g5. The idea is to open the long diagonal for your queen to join the attack against the king. If black cover with knight, you immediately push pawn to a5, gaining a huge initiative, threatening more material, and continuing your attack relentlessly. If black tries to keep their extra material and instead retreats the king to e8 to guard the queen, you continue with queen to h5, a crucial move that keeps the pressure high and gives the opponent no time to breathe. The king is forced to keep moving, and after queen takes pawn on a5, check followed by bishop to c4 check, the king is driven into a mating net. One of the most satisfying finishes to this attack is pushing pawn to d4, a central thrust that many players play on the very first move, but here it serves as the final winning blow.